Okay, so this demonstration is going to show you how to use oil clay provided in your toolkit to create a small scale model for your foam sculpture. And I mentioned that this will serve as a sort of roadmap as you start to subtract material away from the foam block. So it's important that you spend the necessary time on this model to create a really solid plan. It'll only make the subtractive sculpting easier. Oil clay is commonly used by sculptors to create models, and it's a great material. It's made of oil, wax, and clay minerals, but it will not respond to air the way water-based clay will. It will never dry out. One thing to keep in mind, and you saw this at the beginning of the video, I softened my clay in warm water. So it'll become much more malleable with the heat of your hands, but if you want to kind of fast forward that project, you can either use a hair dryer or a bowl of warm water. So I put the water in the microwave for about 3 minutes, and then I allowed the block of oil clay to soak for about 20 minutes. So right now I have my sketch beside me so I can use that as a guide, and I can, if I dissect the piece visually, I can dissect it into two halves. So you can see I've split the block of oil clay into two halves, and I'm now trying to get a very general shape of those two halves. They're kind of shaped like two domes. One has a rounded portion of negative space. The other one has almost like a crescent portion of negative or empty space. And because this clay never dries out, you can use it for multiple projects. It will stay fairly soft, so you just want to be careful to not drop it or hit it very hard after you're finished. The tools that I'm using to sculpt with oil clay are a butter knife, and you'll see in the end I'll also use my X-Acto blade that's in your toolkit. You might also consider using the small loop tool that's in your foam sculpture block kit. You can use various tools with the oil clay. Just be aware that if you're using something, I wouldn't use something like a file or a rasp because it will clog the tool very easily. But carving tools like a loop tool or a knife are really good. So here I'm starting to define that negative space, paying attention to proportions and the object's edges, and always keeping in mind how each half relates to the other. Now I'm comparing the two halves. I also want you to use the majority of the block of oil clay. Even if you're confident that you can sculpt on a really tiny scale accurately, it'll be much easier to have the model be as large as possible. So as I work on this second half, this is the half with the crescent moon shape, I'm again looking at the primary contour of the negative area, looking at how that relates to the negative space on the other half. I try to flatten the shape and look at the edges and the basic shape of the edges, which I could compare to a letter C. This is an abstract sculpture based on the work of Stephanie Metz. One half down the center line has almost a spine that is convex, and the back side, or what I would consider the back side, has a crease or a seam that is concave. So as I'm attaching the two halves, I'm thinking of those opposite parts, the convex and the concave. And as I concentrate on the bottom of the sculpture and how it interacts with the ground plane, I'm filling in more material on the bottom. There's a slight lift on the bottom, but for the most part it's filled in, unlike the top that has a crease. And what's great about oil clay is that it sticks to itself. You'll notice as you work with it, your hands will get kind of oily or sticky. It's best to get that feeling off your hands with a dry paper towel because it's oil and wax. If you try just plain water, it will resist and it won't get that feeling off. But if you start cleaning with just a dry towel, that will do a lot better. So I have the basic form down at this point. Now I'm working on smaller surface details, adding more material where I feel that there needs to be more visual mass, and cutting away material where I feel that the negative space needs to be increased. So I'm constantly turning the model around, and you'll do this when you start to do your subtractive sculpture. Make sure you're viewing it from all sides and there's a great sense of visual movement from all vantage points. So at this point I'm working on the visual line of that spine that comes out and making sure that it's a continuous line or edge and wraps around the negative portion or the hole of the opposite side. And that will almost add as like a little path to lead the viewer's eye around the entire sculpture. From this point on, I'll be doing a lot of smoothing and making sure that the proportions are accurate. And I am aware that I don't want this portion that I'm carving now to be too thin. When you do subtractive sculpture, you want to be aware of portions that are too fragile. When you're subtracting away, it's really difficult or actually impossible to add on to the piece. So you can imagine if I had a large piece of marble and I was sculpting away and I had a fragile finger, if that finger accidentally got removed, that would be really difficult to recover from. So I want to make sure that these thin portions are thick enough to survive the carving process. I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut out a wedge of clay to better define that crease. That'll add interest to an otherwise really simple side. And I didn't do it during my model making, but as I'm sculpting the foam block, I may consider, because this is a very simplistic sculpture, I may consider adding texture areas to the concave portions. That might add necessary visual variety to an otherwise really simplistic piece. So although you want your oil clay model to be as accurate as possible, if you feel that when you move to the foam portion that things need to be changed to create a more dynamic 3D composition, by all means make revisions along the way. Obviously you can see that this video is sped up but I did spend about an hour sculpting this piece. So make sure you set aside enough time to make a strong clay model.